Welcome back to part 2 of my top 50 coasters I've ever ridden. Last time I talked about the Bottom 25 that had some pretty interesting highlights and placements, so if you haven't watched that one, go ahead and click on the annotation on the top right of this video. For key factors on my top 25, 2 coasters are part of my Hidden Gems series, 5 of them are launch coasters, and the singular coaster that holds the longest, fastest, and tallest stats I've ridden doesn't even crack my top 10. So without further ado, let's continue where I left off. My name is Avery, and this is United Coasters. Starting number 25 is Silver Bullet at Knott's Berry Farm. Talk about the best coaster for a park entrance, with that perfectly profiled cobra roll, not to mention the change in the conventional setup inversions compared to other B&M inverts, and that still throws me off, but that just makes Silver Bullet even more memorable to me. On top of that, the insane helix coast of the water is as forceful as it is picturesque to look at, and I can't go on to the next coaster until I talk about Silver Bullet's unique color scheme. Like I said before on this channel, Silver Bullet has the best color scheme than any B&M I've currently been on. At number 24, we have the Defunct Coaster that had such a unique layout in Scorpion at Busch Gardens, Tampa. This Schwarzkopf-made silver Aero model roller coaster was the only one in the US, and according to RCDB, the only looping coaster that had the name Scorpion, a name that is so underused in my opinion. Speaking more on the coaster, Scorpion packs some wild forces within its small layout. With less than 2,000 feet of track, this coaster has a vertical loop right after the first drop, and a powerful double helix to finish the ride. The pacing of this coaster wasn't the best, but it did make up for it by keeping the best elements close to the ground. It's actually amazing that a coaster with a vertical loop stood only 60 feet tall, and before concluding with that figure 8 move of twists and turns, the ride's track passes through the vertical loop. I really wish this coaster could have stayed at the park longer, as it's good enough to be in my top 25. The only solace I can gain is that I was one of the lucky ones who got to ride it. Next, we have the second best Woody in Texas, with Texas Stingray at SeaWorld San Antonio. I won't lie, this coaster had to grow on me after multiple rides, and just like other Woodies, Texas Stingray gets better depending on when you ride it. This is especially true for this one because the ride is faster when it's colder. Standing in the back of SeaWorld, this makes it feel secluded, but that just makes it more impressive to look at. With a track height of only 96 feet, this coaster is surprisingly well paced from that first drop to its final brakes. And even though the POV makes that first drop look kinda gradual, it's far from that, and it's a rare choice from GCI, who usually does twisted drops rather than the conventional straight drop. Considering this is one of the newer builds by GCI, they got their lateral forces down to a science on Texas Stingray. Overall, this is a long and well-paced coaster for SeaWorld. Going from one SeaWorld to another, we have Kraken at SeaWorld Orlando. This is the first of some of the greatest coasters I've ridden from this manufacturer, and it doesn't disappoint with its stunning visuals and 7 total inversions. Even with them being exaggerated, you're taking them fast. So unlike other coasters where you get that hang time feeling from a lack of speed, you feel pushed into your seat even at the top of the first loop. Stepping away from the layout, I was also stunned by how SeaWorld plays the profile of the end of the ride, with the final corkscrew popping out from under the ground. This won't be the last coaster on my list that uses underground spots to gain more speed, but Kraken uses it to its advantage at the end of the second loop. To top it off, the theming of this coaster is honestly pretty cool, from its entrance and the coloring of the track. We head all the way to the other side of the country to look at Full Throttle at Six Flags Magic Mountain. The only created Skyrocket 3 model is unlike any other ride I've been on, and it is yet another coaster that looks beyond belief to see in person. I was blown away when walking underneath the giant 160-foot tall loop and seeing riders getting launched to its top speed in a matter of seconds. The fact that Full Throttle has 3 launches, 1 being backwards, and 2 inversions also gets me excited, as it's not just a one-trick pony. From the negative G sensation at the top of the loop to the backwards launch in the tunnel to the near 90-degree drop at the end of the ride, this coaster is packed with surprises. And considering that this coaster model is the newer iteration of a Skyrocket 2, you can feel that same resemblance on the last drop where you kinda get thrown from your seat on the descent. This whole experience is great despite being a relatively short ride compared to others at Magic Mountain. But we'll talk about the other coasters here later as we head to Six Flags Over Georgia to talk about Twisted Cyclone. This is one of the small RMC hybrids, but it can't be considered a negative considering how much the original track RMC had to work with and how much they accomplished with it. Despite its size, this coaster does not let up, with 3 inversions and multiple sections of airtime. At its time of creation, Rocky Mountain Construction really started hitting their stride in the process of selecting its best elements for its coasters, and the combination of the step-up underflip to the barrel roll down drop shows that. And I still can't get over that first drop too. Seeing that it looks like you should just be doing a normal first drop, but the coaster angles right, sending you left underneath the track you thought you would end on. And I can see why people put this near or even at the top of the best coasters at Over Georgia, because Twisted Cyclone is just relentless. Next, we go to yet another legendary coaster, Kumba at Busch Gardens, Tampa. This B&M has no wasted space, with every element and inversion leaving me with a dumb smile on my face. And I start that smile just on the lift hill when Kumba climbs through its first loop. That's just something so awesome about this coaster that needs to be replicated more. Going more into the start of the second part, the iconic interlocking corkscrews deliver some of the best moments on Kumba. Pair that with the fact that you're soaring high in the first half to cruising low to the terrain on the second makes Kumba one of the best complete coasters around. But a B&M model that slightly goes above that is Superman Krypton Coaster at Six Flags Fiesta Texas. This coaster holds a sense of magnitude at the park, and it shows that from the loop where Superman is set on top. And that loop is another great element. Going high above the quarry wall to all the way down is something that you can't experience at any other park. Considering it's the biggest coaster at Fiesta Texas, Superman takes up a lot of space but uses every bit of it with its 6 inversions. This is the best Flores coaster I've been on, and it even shares the interlocking corkscrews that Kumba has. Next we have, without a doubt, the best wooden roller coaster in all of Texas with Boardwalk Bullet at Kimo Boardwalk. This is the most compact PCC wooden coaster, but gives off the most aggressive forces that I've ever had on a Woody. Boardwalk Bullet is so fast and the layout is so windy that it gets difficult to track. That's even more apparent when you're standing in the station and you see that train go over and even underneath you. What this coaster does better than any other wooden one I've ridden is the lateral forces and how it pops you up on the turns. Boardwalk Bullet isn't remembered for the drop, but rather the speed and intensity of the ride throughout the layout. This is a perfect Woody to marathon, and I consider it to be a strong bucket list coaster for people who haven't rode it, because after riding Boardwalk Bullet, I can guarantee you that it's worth a visit to Houston, especially if you're night riding this thing. Going back to Six Flags Over Georgia, we have the second flying coaster I've been on with Superman Ultimate Flight. In general, B&M flyers are unlike any other experience that you'll have on a coaster, and for Superman Ultimate Flight, that experience remains consistent. Despite the name, after the iconic pretzel loop, Superman has you flying close to the ground and acts more like a terrain coaster towards the end. I mean, it even flies through ditches and a tunnel. That doesn't mean it's a negative though, as being close shows you how fast you take these elements. Going back to the pretzel loop, it's one of the most gut-wrenching experiences one can offer on a coaster. I just wish it wasn't the very first element on Ultimate Flight. Regardless, this ride is both intense and graceful at the same time. Up next, we have Titan at Six Flags Over Texas. And for my records, this is the longest, fastest, and tallest coaster I've ever been on. This Giovanola-made roller coaster is the epitome of intensity. With 2 sets of helices and the initial drop going underground, Titan looks like something out of a coaster head's dream. The amount of time undergoing positive G's on this ride is insane, as that's all Titan has to offer. So why isn't this coaster in my top 10? Well, that's because positive G's is all that it does. There's barely any sense of airtime or negative G's. Another major downside is that mid-course brake run, practically zapping all the speed away from the coaster. But Titan goes almost to a complete stop, and sometimes it does, and just rolls into the next helix. The bigger offense is all the straight sections at the end, where this coaster could have had some hills or airtime to spice it up. Like I said before, positive G's are the only thing this ride has to offer, and it did cause me to gray out on that first helix. But since Titan is a one-trick pony, albeit a great one, it's gotta be placed where it is. Now we'll head back to Fiesta Texas to talk about my second favorite coaster, Poltergeist. This is my first ever launch coaster, and because of that, holds a special place in my heart, as that launch is just a great, forceful experience. Poltergeist has you go from 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds flat, reaching high into the sky to undergo a spaghetti bowl. And that speed is consistent throughout the entire course, as you're thrown wildly in every direction on that ecto green colored track, even completing 4 inversions before reaching the station. To be honest with you, even though I marathoned this coaster, I can only remember 3 inversions, with the initial Cobra roll having 2 and the corkscrew at the end making it 3. So wherever that Sidewinder element is placed in between the two just adds to my amazement. Another thing that elevates Poltergeist is the theming it's gotten over the recent years. From the queue line having that car that honks randomly, to the eerie music throughout the attraction, to the haunted house theme with flashing lights, chandeliers, and even moving paintings. The whole experience and ride placement in the park, for that matter, feels like it's an entire park area in itself. That amount of theming is rare for any Six Flags park, so I'm glad they did Poltergeist right. Going from that launch to my fastest launch ever, we have Accelerator at Knott's Berry Farm. This ride is such a trip in that it looks extremely intimidating. Just walking into the station and waiting for your ride inside the layout and watching the coaster cycle multiple times, your adrenaline is just building up. But never had I had that adrenaline snap away as fast as it did on any ride other than Accelerator. That's because for as fast as this 82-mile-per-hour coaster is, it's surprisingly super smooth. Despite that speed, if you look while you're being launched, you can see the climb up to the top hat and get that serene look of the area before being sent back down at 90 degrees. And instead of just slowing down into the station, Accelerator continues after the top hat, going through a set of deep banking turns into the final brakes. There isn't that much to talk about in terms of layout, so the biggest saving grace is that Accelerator has that launch and the feelings of anticipation while waiting to go on. Out of all the coasters I've ridden, nowhere has it been more apparent to see people scared to get on to genuinely laughing and clapping when they get off. Despite it being an easy coaster for me to ride, I can see Accelerator being that coaster to conquer at Knott's, and what a reputation to have. We stay in California for the legendary, first of its kind, dueling RMC hybrids, Twisted Colossus at Magic Mountain. I know that this coaster used to be on top of people's bucket list, and was even considered to be on mine too, but even before riding it, I had mixed feelings. Getting the good stuff out first, I love how Twisted Colossus has a Mobius loop layout. meaning that you don't have to exit into the ride again for the second track. This also means that you get 2 rides every time you go on it. Despite its drawn out layout, this coaster delivers on its elements as any RMC does, and even more considering that it duels. The high 5 element is great along with the Top Gun stall, and it's really awesome to see 2 massive coaster trains so close to each other. The layout interweaves between themselves, and you get to do unique forces depending on the track. Going from the initial hops to that first drop off the Litz hill, this ride is non-stop fun. Now for the negatives. It's only one, but it's massive. The coasters don't always duel. Even with the lift track slowing or speeding up trying to sync up the coaster trains, I feel that it's rare for a duel to happen nowadays. At first I thought it wouldn't be an issue on crowded days, seeing that the dispatches would allow for a better chance of syncing up. But even with the 45-minute wait time, I still didn't get a chance to duel. Twisted Colossus still ranks high because of what it can deliver, but it will stay out of my top 10 and will have to get reevaluated whenever I get that perfect duel. The last coaster outside of my top 10 is the B&M Goliath at Six Flags Over Georgia. Now I know it's hotly debated on if Goliath is considered a hyper or not, depending on the initial hype versus the drop. But considering that it's the only second hyper I've been on, I'm considering it as one. At the time of its first opening, it was rare for Six Flags to invest so much in a B&M hyper, and it still blows my mind that Over Georgia even has Goliath. For it to be placed in the middle of the park just to have it exit and have most of its layout in the parking lot and even over the front lake justifies how monumentous this layout is. But going into that layout, Goliath is an airtime machine, giving out graceful negatives in the beginning to aggressive ejectors on the hills at the end. Pairing that with a high off the ground helix, this is everything I wanted Titan at Over Texas to be. Not only does Goliath deliver on great moments of airtime, but it also deals crushing positives on that helix. And unlike most coasters where you have to ride it to get that true feel of airtime, you can just look at Goliath's POVs to see where the train is undergoing floater and ejector times, especially at the ending stretch. Even though this layout is an out and back one, there is never a dull moment as you're constantly being thrown up or crushed into your seat. It's arguably the best ride at Six Flags Over Georgia and deserves the praise it gets from its community. And I'm saying all that as Goliath is just barely phased out of my top 10. So what does get in? Well, I'll tell you, but before I do, if you haven't already and like what you're seeing, please be sure to hit like and subscribe. It really helps. Starting off my top 10, we have one of the best themed multi-launch coasters in Florida with Cheetah Hunt at Busch Gardens Tampa. Out of all the rides at Busch Gardens, Cheetah Hunt was one of the ones I would have marathoned for hours. And I know that people think that this coaster is a borderline family coaster, but isn't due to that one inversion, but I'll be the first to tell you that it's way more than that. Looking past the first launch out of the station, the second launch in that trench to the Windcatcher Tower is unreal. And after that, Cheetah Hunt stays low to the ground going through ravines and over water, even completing that tight Heartline roll. My favorite part of the coaster is after the roll, where you complete a series of bends through the ditches. And I love how the theme of being a cheetah coincides completely with the ride, especially on those bends, where it feels like you're the cheetah itself, weaving through the landscape. The low to the ground terrain adds to the excitement of this coaster, and this is all before you hit that third launch that sends you back up into the air for a nice pop of airtime. All these forces make Cheetah Hunt a fun and surprisingly long ride. For number 9, we return to Texas for Mr. Freeze Reverse Blast at Over Texas. Besides this one only clone at Six Flags St. Louis, this type of coaster is rare. Using the same propulsion as Poltergeist, Mr. Freeze uses 2 sets of limbs to send riders through its shuttle track. What makes it awesome is getting initially launched backwards on some of the most fluid and intense elements a shuttle coaster can offer. The fact that you start this coaster completely enclosed, not being able to see what's ahead, just adds to the excitement. And then that launch has you reaching its top speed in just 3.8 seconds to some of the coolest elements. Undergoing that inside top hat to then going up the vertical spike is something you have to feel rather than just seeing, especially the vertical spike portion. That's because the LIMs that are outfitted on it boost you up higher and then boost you downward to get enough speed to send you back into the station. So when you're staring down at the ground from that vertical spike, you can feel the 3 changes of momentum that are all happening in a matter of seconds. And it's on that return trip that I get a sense of the height of this coaster and all the forces on that inside top hat. Something that I haven't experienced from Mr. Freeze is riding it when the train's facing forward, but luckily depending on which queue you take when entering, you can now pick a forward facing or reversing facing train. But that just means I had to go back to get the full experience on this coaster. Heading back to Busch Gardens Tampa for number 8, we have the first dive coaster I've been on, SheiKra. Standing a whole 50 feet taller than Dr. Diabolical's Cliffhanger, this dominates the surrounding area with its striking red track and classic B&M roar. What SheiKra does better than the other dive coaster is its near-miss elements and is on par with theming. A stunning thing about this coaster is the panoramic view you get on top before the drop. Being so high up, you get an amazing view of the entire park before staring down at that first drop. Right after that implement, you're flying what feels like inches away from the second block break and a blink and you're missing moment. After the second hang, you're dropped into a tunnel going underneath a body of water. I don't know about you, but seeing that giant coaster train vanish under the water is just so cool. And then you rise up, turning around, getting level with the water to do a splash effect to reduce speed before getting back to the station. Even though SheiKra only has one inversion, its layout filled with free fall sensations mixed with beautiful theming makes up for it, especially since that splash effect interacts with the guests nearby via splash zones. SheiKra wasn't originally on my bucket list, but it should have, and it's a perfect coaster for Busch Gardens Tampa. We return back to Fiesta, Texas to talk about my favorite coaster there, Iron Rattler. This coaster is fierce, excellent in pacing, and to this day still gets me on that gut-wrenching feeling on its 2 drops. After adding 60 roller coasters to my count, Iron Rattler remains consistent in raising my adrenaline every time I ride it. Just like other RMCs, the forces felt here are incredible. The elements are so unique, and the use of the quarry wall not only provides a good backdrop, but a great breather for the crazy ride. Being the first RMC with an inversion, the 0G roll or heaven roll putting you on top of the wall is executed perfectly. There isn't any bunny hill portions, but the second drop off the quarry wall gives out a breathtaking pop of ejector airtime. Overall, Iron Rattler is amazing and offers some of the smoothest rides that any RMC I've been on can offer. This coaster is one of the ones that does benefit riding during the heat of the day, where the transitions are taken way faster than any POV can pull off to show. And night rides are legendary, especially at the tunnel section at the end where you can't see anything, only hearing the echoes of everyone screaming around you. And even though this isn't my home park, Iron Rattler is still considered to be one of the best in my opinion, and that's why it sits in my top 10. Going from one of my old favorites to a new favorite, we have X2 at Six Flags Magic Mountain. From POVs and off-ride perspectives, I knew that X2 would be crazy, but nothing could prepare me for how utterly insane this coaster is. Out of all the coasters that I've heard about, X2 is the only one that lives up to its stories on how intense it is. I thought the track itself would make it uncomfortable. Instead, besides the flipping seats, X2 is actually smooth. That's because unlike the SNS free spins, X2 uses pre-programmed flips to position you to where it wants you to look. So when you hear everyone talk about how they were looking straight down at that 215-foot drop, it wasn't by choice. The onboard music and pyrotechnics just adds to the intensity of X2. And if you ever claim to be a die-hard coaster fan, then consider taking on X2 as your rite of passage. If I was going for intensity, X2 would have taken the crown. But since this is my list of the overall best, X2 sits just outside my top 5. I had a hard time organizing my top 5, so after much deliberation, here it is. Starting out my top 5, we have the absolute best RMC I've ridden with Airforce 1 at Fun Spot America in Georgia. This ground-up RMC took the best aspects of every coaster made before it and effortlessly crushed it. For starters, the track profiling makes it a showstopper, and since it's placed on the side of the highway, it literally is with that dive loop and 0G stall combination. If you wanted a coaster that gave multiple seconds of ejector airtime, then this is the ultimate coaster for you. The best moment for me on the ride is after the stall where you hit the outward banking airtime hill. This absolutely crushed my shoulders and their restraints, as I was raised above my seat for the entirety of this element. After the arcade roll, you get placed close to the ground with another outward pop of airtime, ending that turnaround with a barrel roll. Even with all these transitions and inversions, Airforce 1 doesn't lose speed, and it shows with its 6 bunny hills at the end, each delivering thigh-crushing moments of ejector airtime. Because this is the only extreme coaster at Fun Spot, I marathoned this until my legs got sore from the ending hills. And just like every coaster in my top 5, I'd ride Airforce 1 again in a heartbeat. At number 4, we have Montu at Busch Gardens, Tampa. Since Iron Gwazi wasn't completed at the time of my visit, this is what coaster I consider to be the best at the park. And since I have no bias for a comparison, I'll be the first to tell you that Montu deserves this placement. In terms of theming, no other coaster on this list has made me say wow when walking up to it more than Montu. With its total of 7 inversions, from its first drop to its end, Montu does not let up. Even if you think the mid-course block break would slow the rest of the course down, you drop off it into a vertical loop, where Montu continues its great speed. With such a long track, this coaster feels endless, and you can feel the blood rushing to your feet constantly. Another unspoken aspect of Montu is that it definitely benefits with the heat of the day, where it feels almost too fast for its layout and have you wobbling out of the station at the end of it. And on top of that, the ride is smooth with the elements carrying a real weight to them. That's extremely apparent at the 0G roll, where you experience real weightlessness. The last thing I want to highlight is its many uses of trenches this coaster enters during the layout. It's already one thing that Montu is an inverted coaster where you dangle under the track, but traversing spots below ground level makes it even cooler. Even the loop after the block break is submerged underground. Tying that up with the Egyptian theme, Montu is one of the best inverts that I've ridden. For number 3, we stay in the same state with Manta at SeaWorld Orlando. Besides one major part of this coaster, Manta is the epitome of gracefulness on a coaster. The section after the mid-course block break has you swooping low to the ground while jets shoot water up at you, and having a near-miss element where you get super close to a waterfall. Even before the midpoint, Manta has you undergo an inline twist and a tight corkscrew that flows so well with the flying aspect. But looking at the best part, Manta has an amazing pretzel loop just moments after its first drop. Considering that this is my favorite coaster element, I love how it's highlighted as one of the main focal points for the ride. Other focal points are the jets of water that shoot up on the low swooping turn and the turn by the waterfall. Considering my list of coasters, I feel that Manta stands out as a ride better to watch than to be on. And that's a compliment considering how well themed it is compared to Superman Ultimate Flight. Manta even doubles the amount of versions that ride has and far surpasses it in size. That said, I would make this flyer the ideal one to clone at other places if B&M ever considered that, because in terms of B&M flyers, Manta is a beautiful coaster, and I wish I didn't have to travel half the country to ride it. I even had to travel the other half of the country to ride number 2 on my list, Tatsu. Unlike the other flyers on my list, Tatsu dominates both of them in terms of speed, size, and intensity. The number one coaster on my bucket list did not disappoint, as Tatsu was everything I wanted and more. For starters, Tatsu sits high up on Magic Mountain, so you can see this ride almost anywhere in the park. When I visited, I rode this coaster at rope drop, and even though it was still warming up, I could feel all the gut-wrenching forces this coaster has. Take Manta, turn it up to 11, and you have Tatsu, especially on the pretzel loop, where the momentum at the start is actively being pushed downward to complete the element. On top of all that, the views from this coaster are unparalleled, as everyone below just looks like ants. I know that I may hype this coaster up, but I couldn't dream of a better flyer than Tatsu, and it's so crazy that it's real. And even more crazy that I actually got a chance to ride this. This coaster gives off some of the best lateral forces on its whippy transitions and delivers the most bone-shaking positives on that pretzel loop. If you live anywhere near Magic Mountain, I strongly recommend Tatsu as a must ride, and I am so jealous you guys have this in your home park. This coaster is pure fun and intensity, and it's my number 2, as my number 1 barely takes that top spot. With number 1 being Mako at SeaWorld Orlando. When I tell you that this coaster is the perfect coaster when it comes to airtime, I'm not exaggerating. 200-foot tall drop with a 73-mile-per-hour top speed, Mako is not for the faint of heart. What this hypercoaster does so well is the balance of positive crushing forces after graceful and forceful moments of airtime. And the absolute best moment on this and any other coaster I've been on is the drop from the hill after the overbank turn. Each drop on Mako took my breath away, but the 6 seconds or so of flow ejector airtime is unlike anything I've experienced on any roller coaster. On Mako, it feels like you'll spend more time out of your seat than in your seat. And even after the midpoint, you get to experience the insanely smooth track of this hypercoaster. And despite what others may say, the last 2 turns aren't an afterthought, as they carry some width to them when you fly into the final breaks. Something that doesn't get disputed is how amazing Mako's layout is, as it's straddled between 2 lakes. I didn't get a chance to ride this at night, but I imagine riding Mako at that time would be truly legendary. If you've ridden Mako before and can't see where I'm coming from with all this praise, then I need you to try it again while riding in the back row. There is no doubt in my mind that riding this hyper that only sports a lap bar in the back row is the way to go for this one, because I guarantee you Mako is a must ride, especially if you're in the area of Orlando, Florida. That does it for my best list of coasters in my top 25. What I'm excited to see is how different this list will be at the end of 2025 as I rewrite and plan to go on new coasters in the future. That's because I plan on expanding my coaster count to 100 and beyond. So please, let me know in the comments how different your list is compared to mine, because of course, it's all opinion based. And if you stayed this long, consider leaving a like and subscribing to stay up to date with my uploads. Lastly, I just want to say thank you for watching, and remember to stay united.